Chapter 18. Interview with a Ghost. Both men looked startled, as did Pete, Bob, and Worthington. But, Pete started to say, they were just wearing women's clothes and wigs, Jupiter said. I realised that when I felt their shoes and discovered they were wearing men's shoes. Then I understood that all 5 of the gang who captured us were really just 2 men in different costumes. You mean the 2 Arabs and the Oriental and the 2 women? They were all Mr. Rex and Mr. Grant? Pete demanded, dumbfounded. He's right. Mr. Rex sounded very weary. We were acting the part of a large gang to give you boys a real scare. The costumes with robes or skirts could be put on and taken off very swiftly. However, I don't want you to think that we actually intended to harm you. I was on my way back to untie you when your friends caught sight of me. We're not murderers, the little man, Mr. Grant, said. Nor smugglers either. We're just ghosts. He chuckled, but Mr. Rex looked solemn. I'm a murderer, he said. I killed Stephen Terrell. Oh, that's right, the little man said, as if it was just something that had slipped his mind, like forgetting to wind his watch. You did do away with him. But that hardly counts. The police may think differently, Worthington said. Lads, I think we should summon the authorities. No, wait, the Whisperer held up his hand. Give me a moment and I'll let you talk to Stephen Terrell himself. You mean talk to his ghost? Pete yelled. Exactly, talk to his ghost. I'll explain to you why I killed him. Before anybody could do anything to stop him, the Whisperer slipped through a door into the next room. Don't worry, Mr. Grant said. He's not trying to escape. He won't be a minute. By the way, here's your knife back, Jupiter Jones. Thank you, Jupiter said. He was attached to that knife. It was barely 60 seconds before the door opened again and a man came out. But this time it wasn't the Whisperer. This man was shorter and younger looking and had neatly combed grey-brown hair. He wore a tweed jacket and looked at them with a pleasant smile. Good evening, he said. I am Stephen Terrell. You wanted to see me. They all stared at him, not knowing what to say. Even Jupiter was silent for once. Finally, Mr. Grant spoke up. It really is Stephen Terrell, he said. And then Jupiter looked as if he had bitten into a nice, juicy apple and found half a worm left in it. He looked angry. At himself. Mr. Terrell, he said, you are also Jonathan Rex, the Whisperer, are you not? Him? The Whisperer? Pete exclaimed. Why, he's not as tall and he's got his hair and... At your service, said Stephen Terrell. He suddenly whipped off a wig and showed a bald head underneath. He stood very straight, making himself look much taller, squinted his eyes, changed the set of his lips, and hissed, Stand still if you value your lives. It was so convincing they all jumped. He was the Whisperer, all right, and he was also the movie star who had supposedly died long ago. That much, at least, Bob and Pete were able to figure out. Mr. Terrell took from his pocket a curious object. It was an artificial scar made of plastic. When I attached this to my throat, took off my wig, and put on elevator shoes, I stopped being Stephen Terrell, he explained. I reduced my voice to a sinister whisper and became that frightening individual known as the Whisperer. He put his wig back on and looked like an ordinary man again. They all started to ask questions at once, and he held up his hand. We'd better all sit down, he said, and I'll explain. You see that picture? He pointed to the photograph on the table, which showed him shaking hands with the Whisperer. Shaking hands with himself, really. That was trick photography, of course, to further the illusion of 2 totally different men. You see, many years ago, when I became a moving picture star, I found my shyness and my lisp made it very difficult to handle my business affairs properly. I hated to talk to people. I couldn't argue for my rights. So I created the character of the Whisperer to be my business manager. The Whisperer always whispered in a fierce tone which hid my lisp, and he looked so menacing that I had no difficulty in dealing with anyone. No one except my friend Charlie Grant here knew that I was both men. Charlie was my makeup man, and he used to help me change from being Stephen Terrell into being the Whisperer. This scheme worked well until I made my first talking picture. Then the whole world laughed at me. It was a terrible blow to my pride. I withdrew to my home. When I learned the bank wanted to take that away from me too, I became despondent and desperate. At the time of building my castle, the workmen had discovered a fault in the rocks of Black Canyon. The fault ran all the way through the ridge to the other side where Winding Valley Road ended. I had the natural tunnel walled up, but secretly installed a hidden door. Then, as Jonathan Rex, I bought the land at the other end of the secret passage and built a small home there. That way I could come and go and no one would suspect my double identity. Often in those days I went for long, solitary drives in an effort to shake off my deep depression. One day I was driving high above the ocean when I conceived the brilliant idea of a faked accident. "You drove your car off that cliff yourself, didn't you?" Jupiter broke in. Terrell nodded. "Yes. First I wrote the note, leaving it where someone would be sure to find it. Then one dark, stormy night I staged the accident, letting my car topple over the cliff, without me in it, of course. And that was the end of Stephen Terrell as far as the world was concerned. Also, as far as I was concerned. To me, he was as good as dead and buried, and I wanted to keep it that way. I also wanted to keep my castle. The thought of anyone else owning it or living in it was too much to bear. Although the castle was empty now, I could enter it at will through the natural tunnel. So I was secretly on hand when the police conducted their search, and I made sure they all left in a hurry. When I built the castle, you see, I installed various devices in it for giving my friends thrills. Later, these were most useful in helping me to build the public impression that the castle was haunted. I even made more of a ghostly disturbance when the bank sent their men to collect my goods. Soon it was scarcely necessary to do anything to frighten those who entered the castle. Their own imagination did it for them. But I made certain that the fearsome reputation of the building did not wane. And just to make the whole spot seem less desirable to anyone who might even think of buying it, I occasionally rolled rocks down the hillside to the road. My scheme worked. No one wanted to buy the castle from the bank. Meanwhile, I began to save money to buy it myself. As Jonathan Rex, a breeder of rare pet birds, I acquired almost enough money for a down payment. Then you boys came along. The actor sighed. You boys were much more stubborn than anyone else had ever been, he said. Mr. Terrell, asked Jupiter, who had been listening intently, did you phone us after our first visit and use a spooky voice to scare us? The man nodded. I thought it would help keep you away. But how did you know we were coming that night? And how did you know who we were? Jupiter asked. The actor smiled slightly. My friend here, Charlie Grant, is my lookout, he said. The very short man nodded. Just at the entrance to Black Canyon there is a small bungalow barely visible. Charlie lives there. Whenever he sees anyone enter the canyon, he telephones me, and I hurry through the tunnel to be ready for them. When he saw the Rolls-Royce go up the canyon, I recognized it from his description as being the car I had read about in the paper. And of course I had also read that you were the one who had won the use of it. You boys left rather hurriedly that night. Don't feel badly about that. Others have left even more swiftly. I returned to my bungalow and looked for your name in the telephone book. Not finding it there, I called information and found you did have a telephone. So I called you. Oh, Jupiter said, and Pete scratched his head. As Jupiter had said, answers to mysteries can be simple when you know them. But until you know them, they can seem very tough. Then that's why Skinny Norris, that is, those other two boys, left in such a hurry the day Pete and I came to see you, Jupiter remarked. Yes. Charlie had warned me, and I was waiting for them. However, your arrival at almost the same time caught us unprepared. Little Mr. Grant looked embarrassed. I'd like to explain about that, boys, he said. When you drove up, it was too late for me to warn my friend Steve, so I slipped into the canyon by a side trail to keep watch. I saw those other boys run out, and watched you chase them. Then I accidentally started a rock rolling, and you looked and spotted me." "So it was you we were trying to catch," Pete exploded. "And you sent that rock slide down on us?" "It was truly an accident," Mr. Grant said earnestly. "The rocks were piled there to push down on the road some time when they might help discourage a prospective buyer. I tried to hide behind them and dislodge them. I was extremely worried that you'd been seriously hurt, though I saw you duck into that rocky crevice. Then I saw the end of a stick appear through the dirt blocking the entrance, and I deduced you were safe. I waited there until you were safely out, however. If you'd encountered difficulty, I would have come to your aid." At this point, Pete couldn't think of anything more to say. At least Mr. Terrell's and Mr. Grant's explanations had cleared up several mysteries. It was easy now to see how the two men had managed to be ready for them every time any of the three investigators had visited the castle. Jupiter was still scowling. "I believe I understand most of what happened," he said, "but a few points still remain unclear." "Ask anything you want to," the actor encouraged him. "You've earned the right to know the answers." "The afternoon we called on you, Mr. Terrell," Jupiter said, "you had a pitcher of lemonade freshly made as if you were expecting us. You also said you'd been cutting dry brush, and that wasn't true. They are small points, but I'd like to clear them up." The actor chuckled slightly. "After you escaped from the cave," he said, "you were too preoccupied to see my friend Charlie shadowing you back to the car. He was hidden close enough to hear you give the chauffeur my address. As soon as you drove off, he telephoned me. I immediately got ready for you. From my window, I can see down into a stretch of winding valley road. That antique Rolls-Royce with its gold trimming is a car very easily recognised. As soon as I saw it, I made the lemonade, then slipped out into the bushes, carrying the machete as an excuse. I was watching you as you came up my path. At that point, I had not decided just how to handle you. I finally decided to be friendly, give you a cold drink, and try to impress you with the frightening quality of Terror Castle so that you would stay away of your own accord. Please remember that I did my best to tell you as few untruths as possible. Of course I said that Stephen Terrell was dead, but so he was in my mind. I also said I never entered the door of the castle again. I never have. I've gone and come through the tunnel. Having the entrance inside my cage of birds, I've been able to slip in and out without ever being noticed. Tonight I was in such a hurry I left the door open, and the birds got into the tunnel." Jupiter was pinching his lips again. "The gypsy warning you sent us, Mr. Terrell," he said. "That was your friend Mr. Grant dressed up as an old gypsy woman, was it not?" "Exactly, my boy. When I learned you three were investigators, I knew you might be persistent. So Charlie made up as a gypsy woman and brought you the second warning. I did hope it would scare you into staying away." "It actually made me curious, Mr. Terrell," Jupiter said politely. "No one else ever had any warnings. I wondered why we were getting them. Ghosts don't bother to warn people. So I deduced someone human didn't want us at Terror Castle. Then when I studied the photographs Bob made, I noticed the suit of armour in Echo Hall wasn't very rusty, and there wasn't much dust in your library. After so many years, there should have been lots of rust and dust. It certainly looked as if someone was secretly taking care of things in Terror Castle. And the person the castle meant most to was the owner, Stephen Terrell. So I deduced at last that you were still alive, sir. Of course, you threw me off the track tonight by acting the role of a gang of international smugglers when you captured us. I believe you were an Arab, the Oriental and the Englishwoman. And Mr. Grant was an Arab and the old gypsy." "That is correct." Stephen Terrell's eyes twinkled. "We used part of my large collection of wigs and costumes. I wanted to give you a lasting scare. I thought that if you were worried about the vengeance of a gang of smugglers instead of mere ghosts, you might abandon your investigation of Terror Castle. You were really becoming much too persistent." "Well, that just about gives you the whole story. Is there anything else you'd like to know?" "There's plenty," Pete piped up now. "For one thing, what about the eye that looked at us from the picture the first night?" "That was my eye," Stephen Terrell said. "There's a secret passage behind the paintings, and there was a peephole in the picture. But Bob and I examined the picture later on, Pete argued. There wasn't any hole in it. After you fled, I hung another similar picture there, Mr. Terrell said, just in case you came back to examine it. But the Blue Phantom, Pete asked, and the old organ playing that weird music, and the fog of fear, and the ghost in the mirror, and the cold draft in the Hall of Echoes? I hate to tell you, the actor said. It's like a magician telling how he performs his tricks. It takes the mystery away from them. But you've earned the right to know, and if you really want to. I believe I have been able to deduce some of the methods you use, sir, Jupiter said. The cold draft was a flow of gas from melting dry ice coming through a hole in the wall. The weird music was a record played backwards through an amplifier. The Blue Phantom was probably cheesecloth covered with luminous paint. The fog of fear was no doubt some chemical that makes smoke, forced into the secret passage through small holes. You're right, boy, Stephen Terrell admitted. I suppose that once you realised a human agency was behind the strange manifestations, you were able to deduce the method of creating the effects. Yes, sir, Jupiter told him, and the ghost in the mirror was probably a projection of some kind. But one thing I'm not sure of. How did you manage to induce the feeling of nervousness and terror inside the castle? Please don't ask me to tell you everything, the actor begged. I'd like to preserve some of my secrets. As it is, you found out enough to ruin all my plans. I want to show you something. Look. He flung open the door through which he had ducked to change himself from the sinister whisperer into Stephen Terrell. Within, they saw a large dressing room. There were costumes of every kind hanging from the wall. Wigs were piled high on wig stands, and in one corner was an enormous pile of the sort of round cans used for storing motion picture film. There, in that room, the actor said, there is the real Stephen Terrell. Those costumes, those wigs, all those motion pictures stored in the cans, those are the real me. Stephen Terrell is just an instrument that transformed those costumes and wigs into strange characters to provide enjoyable thrills for millions of people all over the world. For many years, Terror Castle was my last pride. There I was still frightening people instead of being laughed at. And all the time I was practicing. I cured my lisp. I managed to speak with a deeper voice. I learned to sound like a ghost, a woman, a pirate, an Arab, a Chinese, dozens of others. I dreamed of making a comeback. But as those years passed, the kind of motion picture I made was no longer desired. Now scary pictures are often produced just to get people to laugh. Old pictures shown on television have funny voices and sounds added to produce laughter, and I refuse to degrade my talents to provide cheap laughter. Mr. Terrell was becoming quite excited. He slapped his fist into his palm and was breathing hard. But now there's nothing left for me. I can't be the Phantom of Terror Castle any more. I'll lose the castle itself. I can't be the Whisperer. I don't know what I'll do. He paused to get control of himself, and Jupiter, who had been pinching his lip practically off, spoke again. Mr. Terrell, he asked, do those cans in there contain all of the wonderful scary films you made, which no one has seen for many years? The actor nodded, looking at him. What are you thinking of? He asked. I have an idea how you can get your castle back and still go on entertaining people by scaring them, Jupiter said. You see, and, as usual, Jupiter had hit upon an incredibly good idea.